Good morning, everybody. My name is Yu Wang from FM Global. I will be chairing this session and introduce our speaker today. It's my great honor to introducing Professor Stoliarov to give today's plenary talk. Professor Stoliarov received his master's degree in chemical engineering from the Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology in Russia, and PhD in physical chemistry from the Catholic University of America. Before joining Fire Protection Engineering Department of University of Maryland in 2010, Professor Stoliarov spent 8 years working as a researcher at FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, where several important contributions include the computational tools, MD-React, and ThermoKing. Professor Stoliarov also made a significant contribution towards development of microscale combustion calorimetry, which is a new ASTM standard. At Maryland, Stas teach a range of graduate classes on the topics of fire dynamics, material flammability, and modeling. His research topic engaged in a broad spectrum of activities in developing experimental and computational approach on flammability, pyrolysis model, and battery safety. Today, Professor Stoliarov will be presenting a plenary talk on the topic of pyrolysis model, parameterization, and fire growth. Please join me welcome Professor Stoliarov.
Thank you, Yi, for a kind introduction. So let me begin to give you this simple but insightful example of the problem we're going to talk about. So here is a video that was put together by Isaac Levington a few years back that represents on the left-hand side a test where a small plate of a combustible solid is ignited by a small gas burner at the base. And on the right-hand side, we have a model of this process. The blue bar represents the temperature in the cross-section of the solid, and that orange graph on the right represents heat feedback from the flame to the solid surface. So what you see here, as we start playing this video, the solid starts to gradually heat up, and at some critical point, you start to see some thermal degradation that results in the production of gaseous volatiles. When these gaseous volatiles reach a critical level, the flame establishes on the surface, at which point the burner is removed. Now, as the flame grows, what happens? The amount of gaseous volatiles is increased because the area of the pyrolysis or depth of the pyrolysis of the solid increase. That increases the size of the flame and the heat feedback, and that loop goes and goes and goes. So that is a representation of a typical fire growth problem, albeit at a small scale. And one thing that is clear about this problem to everybody here, I think, is that that problem is quite complex. So for us to deal with that problem, we usually separate it in two sort of parts. One is a condensed phase part that deals with the processes that are responsible to the formation of gaseous volatiles, and the other is a gas phase part that deals with conversion of that gaseous fuel into heat and the heat feedback to the solid surface. So for the most part of this talk, we're going to talk about or focus on the condensed phase part of the problem, but toward the end, we'll try to make a connection back to the overall growth problem. So traditionally, the way we tackle the condensed phase problem in a classical way starts with performing experiments on a particular solid using a fire calorimetry. It can be corner calorimetry or a fire propagation apparatus. You perform serious tests where a small block of material is usually subjected by control radiation, and then you measure the time it takes for this plate to ignite, and also measure both mass loss rate or burning rate, this is how I'm going to refer to it here, and heat release rate as a function of time once burn this plate engages in flame. Subsequent analysis usually involves a number of significant assumptions. One of them is that the material ignites when its surface temperature reaches some critical predefined level. Here it's defined as Tp, and the material is thermally thick. Once you make these two assumptions, you can produce a very neat derivation of approximate time to ignition that relates that time to that critical temperature and a number of other thermophysical properties. One of the key additional assumptions that is used in this derivation is that these heat losses from the surface that occur prior to ignition are actually constant in nature, but once it is assumed to be the case, then you can re-represent this expression in terms of 1 over square root of time and plot the data from multiple tests conducted at relatively large number of heat fluxes. And what you usually get is more or less linear dependence, at least at high portion of the heat flux. By examining this linear dependence, you can determine both parameters of this expression, the intercept and the slope. And from this, you have a model that presumably can interpolate and extrapolate your times to ignition. Then you typically proceed looking at the burning phase. And when you do that, you usually assume that the material burns in a steady state. If you make this assumption, you can conclude that the rate of burning, MF, is the net heat flux into the material solid divided by the energy that is required to take material from its initial temperature through its decomposition, and that quantity is usually referred to as a heat gasification. Now, rearranging this expression, you see that again emerges this linear dependence on external set heat flux, which we control in cone experiments, and then you plot your data as an example. You get that slope, and from that you get the heat of gasification value, and as well you can sort of back out the flame heat flux as well from this analysis. So this approach results in a model that basically represents your burning as a square wave. Both time to ignition and the height of that square wave are defined with the aforementioned formulas, and then the width of the wave is defined by the amount of combustible material available to you. Since the methodology also measures heat of combustion, the straightforward conversion from the heat release rate can be made for well-ventilated environment. So it's a very robust model that is still used quite a bit, but it has a number of disadvantages. One obvious one is that heat release rate or mass loss rate does not look in square wave for majority of the materials. So there's aspects of physics that make it non-flat are basically ignored in this model. And the other one, and it's probably the most important, is that due to a number of sweeping assumptions that has to be made to sort of translate this whole problem into an analytical plane, you end up deriving quantities that do not really represent real physical properties of this material. By itself, this is not an issue, but what it translates into is the limitations of our ability to extrapolate the results of this model to other scenarios. And most of the time, we don't know what those limitations really are. So how do we address this problem? Well, one way is to look and produce a model that has more details and more detailed physics of that side of the fire growth problem. So before we do that, let's examine what I'm talking about here. So here is a very schematic representation of the pyrolyzing solid. Let's assume that we're already covered by the flame and the oxygen concentration in the surface of the material is negligible. What we have is a radiative and convective heat flux from either diffusion flame and or external source. Radiative heat flux may penetrate through the surface if the material is partially translucent. You may also have heat transfer inside the solid that may be a combination of conduction and radiation. Radiation becomes important for porous solids. And then you have radiative heat loss that actually also happens from the depth of the material in a general way. Not all the materials are transparent to thermal radiation. Now, this heat transfer to the solid eventually triggers multiple types of transformations, and examples of these transformations include phase transitions. The other important aspects is thermal decomposition, chemical reactions that are responsible for the thermal degradation of the solids. Both of these phenomena cause morphological changes in the solid. And these morphological changes, in some examples given here, translate into changes in the heat transport properties of the solid. So it's important to understand that within the solid itself, there is a feedback loop that is actually very hard to break when you're analyzing the problem. And it has some implications on how we analyze this problem. Finally, these gases that produced during thermal decomposition reactions are transported back, they reach the flame, they ignite, and they burn. So needless to say, it's a fairly complex picture of this phenomenon, but we have created, as a community, a number of models that can capture most aspects of this physics. So what I'm referring here is a group of what we call comprehensive pyrolysis model. And one example of this comprehensive pyrolysis model is a thermokine, which here is represented in one-dimensional form for simplicity. So in thermokine, what you usually have is the conservation of species and conservation of energy. Conservation of species is usually formulated in terms of this concentration of species, and this is done to decouple it, the conservation of species from density that allows you to simulate both expanding and contracting solids. The terms include accounting for chemical reactions associated with the thermal decomposition, accounting for all forms of heat transfer through the solid, gas transport, which include also convective effects and energy and heat movement associated with the advection of gas through the solid, and finally, the term associated with potential expansion or combustion or contraction of the solid samples. The reaction rates, at least in thermokine, I use this Arrhenius expression that can account for either first order or second order reactions. The gas transport is represented by a hybrid formula that can serve as an approximation for diffusion equation or Darcy's law, depending on the other parameter settings in the model. And finally, the radiation transport in depth is accounted through this generalized form of Beer-Lambert law. So if you pay attention, there is a massive number of parameters in this model. And the challenge is not in solving this model numerically. This is actually fairly straightforward, but dealing with or finding the values of this massive number of parameters. So over the years, and we have developed sort of two leading approaches, I would say, to that type of parameterization. And one of them I refer to as global approach, and this is based on the work of Chris Lattenberger, Guillermo Rein, and Carlos Fernandez Peyo. And that approach is based on the idea, and that is sort of a neat feature of this approach. It basically uses the same data that analytical model does for parameterization with a few maybe additional measurements. The approach usually consists of making an assumption about thermal decomposition mechanisms through this material goes. Usually you try to make an assumption of simple mechanism that you think capture the essential chemistry. And then subsequently you fit all your properties with a few exceptions that you can measure in a straightforward way into the fire calorimetry data. Right? So that fitting exercise is non-trivial. It's a multi-parameter optimization, but in sort of lately, there was a number of algorithms that became available that can tackle this problem very well, including standard software packages out there. So I think the numerical side of this problem is handled pretty well. So what you get as a result is an example here from the same manuscript is a model that's fitted in both surface temperature and mass loss rate. Mass loss rate is usually the main target for the fitting and as you can see, one obvious advantage of this approach is that now you're actually capturing the non-linear forms of this or non-steady forms of this mass loss rate. And as a result of that, certainly capture more physics than the original analytical models. The downside here is again associated with the fact that because we're primarily targeting global quantity, it's not clear that we fully resolve the underlying physical properties that represent this pyrolysis. And because of that, we potentially do not really have an ability to extrapolate far beyond the range of conditions that explode during this parameterization. So an alternative to this approach is what we call hierarchical approach to pyrolysis model parameterization. This is something that we have been developing in our group for the past decade or so, and now it has been being picked up by a few groups around the world as well. So the key feature of this approach is that we do use milligram scale testing to kind of provide us with the thermodynamics and kinetics of the thermal decomposition to start. That milligram scale testing done in an appropriate way allows us to insulate our analysis from the transport that occurs in the solid sample. So we're only looking at the kinetics and thermodynamics. And then subsequently, we add the experimental measurements that include both kinetics and transport. And because we already know the kinetics, it allows us to infer or inversely model what the transport properties are. So to give you a better illustration of that, I'm going to step through an example. So this is an example of polybutylene terephthalate with glass fiber material. It actually has a fairly straightforward decomposition. So this is, for those of you who do not know, this is thermogrametric analyzer, 10K per minute in nitrogen. You get mass versus time curve and mass loss versus time, as well as with respect to the temperature of the sample. That is what's plotted here. So usually you analyze this problem by first assuming the reaction mechanism. In this case, it's a single peak. It's a very straightforward, sort of simple TGA result, and one reaction should be appropriate. And then you feed the parameters of this reaction into the results until you get a good match, which is shown here. The fitting exercise is done with thermokin, but it's a very straightforward exercise. It can be done manually. It can be automated. It can be done manually within 5 to 10 iterations. So it's a very simple process, and it gives you kinetic parameters from that. So the problem of thermal decomposition is not always this simple. So this is the example of polyvinyl chloride that we used 6 consecutive reactions to capture the TGA. That also can be done manually. It's a little bit more laborious. And then an example of nylon 6,6 with rich phosphorus that required 9 reactions to capture thermal decomposition behavior. The neat feature about this last mechanism is that it not only captures particular TGA or particular material, it actually captures changes in the kinetics associated with changing of material composition. So I can, in my resulting model, I can dial change in the concentration of the red phosphorus, and I get correct TGA data from that. So the way it's developed is take a little bit of time to discuss, and I'm not going to review it here in detail. But one thing that this approach does, it allows you to potentially pave a way to intelligent design of flame retardant materials, because we now know the relation between how it decomposes and the thermal composition and the composition of individual components. So once we're done with TGA, we then collect heat flow data. In our case, we collect it in the same part. So TGA and DSC is done at the same time. The DSC, differential scattering calorimetry, or heat flow experiments are not nearly as trivial as TGA experiments. Require a lot more careful calibration, requires a lot more careful sample handling and so on and so forth, but it is possible to derive a meaningful heat flow curve such as the one shown here. And what you can do subsequently, using the thermal decomposition mechanism that you develop in the TGA, you can first determine the heat capacities of your reactants and products and draw baseline. And then you can, through integration, you can obtain information on heats of the processes, the right peak representing the heat of decomposition, and the left peak representing the heat of melting. Finally, combining these results and modeling it all together, and I must mention that in these situations, it's important to take into account that the TGA does not really heat up solids at a perfectly linear heating rate, so that these deviations have to be taken into account for this analysis to work. You end up with a mechanism that includes thermal decomposition step and melting spec and correctly represents the thermodynamics of this process. The last milligram step that we have here is associated with the application of microscale combustion calorimetry, or MCC. This is basically ETGA, where instead of mass loss rate, we measure heat associated with combustion of gaseous components that are produced by the solid. So that is allow us to obtain heats of combustion of gases that evolve in individual steps during the decomposition. Here is one example. On the left-hand side, you have TGA of polyisocyanurate foam, which is fairly non-trivial. And on the right-hand side, you have MCC data. We use our TGA kinetics to model MCC, which is done more or less at the same heating conditions. And then we feed the heats of combustion of individual steps to match the MCC results. And to my knowledge, it's the only step that allows us, or the only tool out there that allows to separate heats of combustion of the gases that evolves. at different temperatures, which can be important for some materials. Right? So with that milligram scale complete, we then move to the gram scale experiments. And here, over the years, figuring out how to do them in the best way, one thing that we concluded is that it's super important for these experiments to be really have a very, very nicely controlled boundary conditions with very little uncertainties and also accompanied by careful measurements. Only then you get the accurate data. We found that none of the standard tools that at least we tried give us that value of accuracy and consistency and certainty. So we designed our own apparatus, which is called controlled atmosphere pyrolysis apparatus, which purpose is to pyrolyze coupon size sample at a fixed radiant heat flux in a well-defined atmosphere. We can control atmospheres with accuracy of about 1% and measure mass of the sample, back surface temperature of the sample, and the shape of the sample simultaneously as a function of time while applying very nice constant thermal boundary conditions in both cases, both convective and radiative. In fact, in this experiment, we can even deal with a sample that swell and decompose. We can account for how the sweating of the sample affects the radiative flux on the surface through pre-calibration. So having this data and knowing everything about material, and I didn't mention here, but one additional thing that you want to do, you want to quantify emissivity and absorption coefficients of the samples. This day is a pretty trivial exercise. You can do it in FTIR equipped with integrating sphere. So once you have that, the only really unknown parameter, the main unknown parameters, is the parameters that defines thermal transport through the solid. And we obtain it by fitting back surface temperature that we derive from couple controlled atmosphere pyrolysis apparatus measurements. So here's an example of this result. Our last step is validation. We have thermal decomposition obtained from milligram scale test. We have thermal transport obtained from gram scale test. If those two work well together, we should be able to predict mass loss rate in those gram scale tests where both processes are operational, and in this particular case, it looks pretty good. Now, I do want to point out that usually we do at least 2 heat fluxes that are sufficiently different to validate our model. For some cases, we do 3 heat fluxes. At the end, we construct the model that hits both milligram scale test and this gram scale test at the same time with high accuracy. So this is the point. Now, the natural question then is, does it always work that way? And the answer is no, it sometimes it doesn't. In fact, here is an example of polybutane terephthalate with glass fiber. The previous one that I showed you was pure PBT, where we do the same exercise and we feed the temperature data and it looks really good, but when we try to predict mass loss rate, we underpredict the mass loss rate considerably. Now, that by itself does not necessarily represent the failure of our approach. What it tells us, basically in this particular case, that we're missing something in our mechanism. Now, one speculation that you can make, well, maybe your kinetics that you extracted at the lower heating rate doesn't work. This is what I hear quite a bit. But reality is the pure PBT is the same material with the same kinetics, and we do it quite well. So that cannot be it in this particular scenario. So speculation suggests for the materials that contain this chopped glass fiber, as is the case here, there is a wick effect that operates the material. We're talking about the melt being wicked through that glass matrix towards the surface, and that's what potentially increases the mass loss rate. Now, we went ahead and done experimental work to confirm that this wick effect is actually present in this material. We found it to be the case. We added to this model, and then we present a good fit. So the example here illustrates that going through this approach, you can identify physical mechanism inside the material that contributes to your pyrolysis that you would likely overlook if you didn't do this way. Okay. So this is all nice, but the big question becomes then, okay, if we can do it really well in that milligram scale. We successfully did address the coupon scale. Does it work at full scale? That's an important question, and that question we're still just starting to answer. But here's an example of our first attempt. So Our full scale is not really full scale. It's about 2-meter tall panels in a corner. It's an SBI-like test with some modifications that make analysis of this problem a little bit easier. For example, we have a symmetric sample with respect to the corner plane instead of asymmetric. The experiments that I'm going to talk about were performed primarily on PMMA, so it's a fairly straightforward material that we have presumably know the properties quite well. And what we measured here is the heat release rate as a function of time. The material is ignited in the corner by a gas triangle, a gas burner, and then the flames spread along the surface. And on the right-hand side, you have a side view of the spread. This is 7 repeated tests. These tests are quite reproducible. We stop it at the point where the panel starts to melt and buckle, so we don't really get that test to the point where there is any significant mechanical distortion. And we get very nice reproducible data. Now, in addition to heat release rate, we collected detailed data on the heat flux to the surface of these combustible panels. This was done by using multiple experiments with multiple heat flux gauges over the surface and allows us to more or less map the heat feedback from the flame. And the reason was to do it is to abstract us to need to model the flame part of that problem. We didn't really want to do that because we felt that by doing that, we're going to add additional uncertainties into the analysis, which we tried to avoid. So with this feedback, using sort of classical point of view, you can assume that the heat feedback in every location, that heat flux, is related to heat release rate. And here is an example of those fits that show that that is exactly the case. And now you can set up a test for your pyrolysis model. Here is how it's done. You take a heat release rate that was obtained in the experiment as a function of time. You feed it in your heat release to heat flux model, and as a result of that, you obtain the heat flux versus time data for every element of the panel that burns in a gradient time. So you have this whole panel divided into the segments, squares, and for each segment you know heat feedback. You have the pyrolysis model of material, you know what the backing properties of material are. You solve the pyrolysis problem in a transient fashion using heat flux versus time for each of these plates. Then you add it all up, and you supposed to regenerate heat release rate that you started with, provided that your pyrolysis model consistent with the observation of the spread. Now, one subtlety here is that what you measure as a heat flux using a water-cooled heat flux gauge, which is sort of the main instruments in which heat fluxes are measured, is a heat flux to the cold surface. It's not the same heat flux as at the surface of the pyrolyzing solvent, right? So to convert one to the other, you have to make an assumption of the nature of this heat flux. And the two limiting assumptions are whether the heat flux is radiative in nature or this heat flux convective in nature. So if you make this assumption that you can take the gauge data and you convert it to the boundary conditions for your solid at each point. So we've done that, and then we produce simulations using the pyrolysis model that was developed using the hierarchical approach. And here you see the comparison between the experimental data and the results of the simulations. So the blue line with arrow bars represent the experimental data. This bottom line represents the assumption that the heat flux feedback is purely convective, and the red line represents the assumption that it's purely radiative. So the good news is that these two lines bound the experimental results. Right? That indicates that overall, our pyrolysis model is consistent with these observations. The bad news is that those are really far apart, which means that knowing heat flux of the panel is really not sufficient for us to make high quality predictions. Now, if you make an assumption that up to about 30 or 40 kilowatts, this flame is primarily convective, and then it gets higher in heat release rate, it's radiative, then you end up with this green dashed line. That represents pretty good representation of the experiment. So this is good news. Our model is really generally consistent with what we see, but there is one subtlety here. The subtlety is that what we've done really is we forced our heat flux to be represented by the results from experiments. So So this is not how the normal model operates. In normal model, you calculate heat release rate, right? You calculate the structure of the flame, and then based on the structure of the flame, you calculate the heat feedback. So you have what we call here, fully coupled simulations, which we artificially uncoupled to look at that problem. So now we decided to see what happens when we couple the simulations. So the difference between what we did before and we did now is that instead of trying to feed the experimental heat release rate and then go to the simulated heat release rate, we started with some simple assumption of this experimental heat release rate should be. Just assume that it's heat release rate from the burner. We then generated simulated heat release rate. We fed it back into our model, and we did several iterations until we have a fully converged solution. So the result is we have the heat fluxes to the surfaces as a function of time that fully consistent with the heat release rate that we simulate instead of being consistent with the heat release rate that we measured in experiments. So what happens then? Well, in this case, things get a little more problematic. So that dashed line in here that looks okay with respect to experimental data suddenly starts to deviate a lot more. In fact, at certain points, it deviates by 100% of the measurements. So why that happens? Well, the answer basically is that as you go all here and you start simulating and starting slightly over-predicting your heat release rate, you also start over-predicting your heat feedback. As you over-predict your heat feedback, you increase pyrolysis rate beyond what's right, and you again further over-predict the heat release rate. So you see how the strong feedback loop forms. That what it basically does, it takes the errors that are not really that large to begin with and amplifies it to something that becomes an acceptable prediction. Now, how large this amplification error is? 10% in the heat capacity uncertainty that considered to be the state of the art for us on the solid site measurements can create 30, 40% uncertainty in the heat release rate. That is really problematic. All right. So it tells us that, that we have an issue here. But I don't want to finish my talk on that sour note. So I'm going to cheer you up a little bit. Turns out if we take the same approach and we apply it to the material that has a much more complicated form of pyrolysis, such as polyisocyanated foam, but is actually not nearly as flammable as PMMA, we actually do quite well with that fully coupled predictions. So, and that is not really a coincidence. It's not just that we happen to formulate the model where we sort of hit that jackpot of the heat release rate predictions. What actually happens is it can be shown that the sensitivity to your property uncertainties is really highly coupled to the strength of that heat feedback between the solid and condensed phase. So when this heat feedback is strong, which is the case for highly flammable material, you have a very high sensitivity of the spread rate to small uncertainties in your parameters. When this heat feedback is weak, that sensitivity is not as high, and you have much more leeway in measuring your properties. So what it tells you is that despite our general point of view that the material PMMA is the simplest material to model and we should focus on that, based on this framework, based on this analysis, PMMA is the hardest material to get the flame spread right because of that super high sensitivity. And there is a likelihood that we transfer to more complex pyrolyzing material with more, but that are not flammable, we actually get more successful. All right, so I think I'm actually pretty on time. So let me just summarize some things that I said today, and I make a point about. First of all, I think that comprehensive pyrolysis models are a path forward. I think we made quite a bit of progress in figuring out how to work them, how to parameterize them. I think there is a lot of work remains to be done, but I think this is the path forward for us to advance of our understanding of the fire growth problem. If I had to think about what primarily should use some development, I would say that the most improvement we can probably gain by figuring out how to do the testing and measurements on the basis of which we parameterize these models better. I think this is where most of the improvement come from, and I don't think that the methodology by which we extract these parameters as important. We want a lot of high quality data, and if we can produce a lot of high quality data, we're going to produce high quality pyrolysis models. Finally, what are the next challenges, or major challenges in this particular case? So to me, one of the next major challenges is to figure out how to couple this model with a mechanical deformation model. This seems to be extremely difficult. We really don't have a single tool that does finite element at the mechanical level and comprehensive pyrolysis, right? But we need to start working on these tools because everything buckles, fall downs, melt flows, and things like that. And we have to go there. We have to find a way, no matter how hard it is. So we have to start working, and probably not me, but the young guys in the audience should think about that problem. The second thing, and this is, I illustrate a little bit better, I think that we need to find a way where we connect our pyrolysis models to the scenarios where we have complex objects consisting of multiple materials that are fundamentally under-resolved. So as an example of that, I'm gonna give this example of FM commodity that is cardboard containing polystyrene cups inside. Right? So we do have a pyrolysis model for cardboard. We do have a pyrolysis model for polystyrene cup. But when it comes to modeling that burning process, we basically throw these models out of the window and start doing medium scale tests to parameterize and then go to higher rate simulations. Now, that is a rational approach. I'm not suggesting that it's not. But I think the way we have to build this science is we have to find a way where pyrolysis models of these materials are connected and scale up, and so we form two model complex objects rather than completely abandoning that and moving to a completely empirical approach. Finally, I'm perfectly on time, I'd like to acknowledge multiple students who contributed to my part of the work that was presented in the slide. I'm highly grateful to them. It would be impossible to get this data, to get this analysis, to get this insight without them. And of course, various fundings organizations that supported this work over a period of time. I really appreciate your attention, and I'll do my best to answer any question you might have.